On the evening of August 15, 1971, U.S. President Richard Nixon went on live television and delivered an 18-minute speech. Most Americans didn't understand what he was talking about. But in reality, with this speech, Nixon committed the most massive and most elegant heist in human history. He took people's gold away from them, leaving them with paper bills. And those bills rapidly began losing their value. People listened to his speech, but most didn't even realize what had happened. When Nixon finished his speech, the world changed forever, and millions of Americans began rapidly growing poorer. To understand what exactly Nixon stole, imagine the economy of the 1960s. At that time, every dollar was backed by gold. Literally, this meant you could walk into any bank and exchange a $100 bill for approximately 3 ounces of gold. The government couldn't just turn on the printing press and print $1 billion. No gold, no new money. The system worked simply. Want to print $100? Show gold worth $100. All the world's currencies were pegged to the dollar, and the dollar to gold at a rate of $35 per ounce. This meant real stability. Your grandfather could set aside $1,000 in 1950 and know that 20 years later they would be worth roughly the same, because behind that money stood real gold. The gold standard protected people from saving's main enemy, inflation. Governments couldn't print money to finance wars or social programs. They were limited by real resources. But it was precisely this limitation that irritated politicians. In the midst of World War II, at the initiative of the U.S. and Great Britain, representatives from 44 countries gathered in the small town of Bretton Woods. Their goal was to create a new financial system that would ensure stability in the post-war world. The essence was simple. The U.S. dollar is pegged to gold at a fixed price, $35 per ounce. All other currencies are pegged to the dollar. The entire world uses dollars for international trade, and the U.S. guarantees that every dollar can be exchanged for gold. This creates trust. Inflation is minimal. People and states are confident that paper money has real value. At that moment, the United States owned the world's largest gold reserves, more than 20,000 tons, which comprised roughly 2/3 of the entire world's gold supply. Other countries trusted the U.S. because America emerged from World War II as the economically strongest power, while Europe lay in ruins. The U.S. had no competitors at the time. This seemed reasonable. But this system contained a deadly trap. The U.S. received a unique privilege. They could print the world's money, and the temptation to abuse this power proved too great. Already in the 1950s to 60s, America began spending dollars like a drunken sailor. The Korean War, the space program, the Vietnam War, the Marshall Plan for Europe, everything required money. President Lyndon Johnson accelerated the printing press even more. His massive social program, the Great Society, when the government began spending billions on the poor, required billions of new dollars, and the U.S. printed them a lot, very much, more and more each year. By the late 1960s, simple arithmetic showed a catastrophe. Outside America, there were $80 billion worth of dollars, while gold in American vaults was worth only $10 billion. This meant that if all dollar holders simultaneously demanded gold, America would go bankrupt. Other countries began to notice this. The French were the first to understand this. In 1965, President de Gaulle publicly called the Bretton Woods system fraud and demanded real gold for their dollars. He sent a warship to New York and took away $150 million worth of French gold. The American government was forced to allow the French to take the gold. Other countries got the hint. Following France, West Germany, Switzerland, and the Netherlands began active exchanges, each demanding to return part of their dollar reserves in the form of gold. Gold flowed out of American vaults like a river. U.S. reserves rapidly melted away. Already in the early 1970s, the volume of dollars in the world significantly exceeded America's gold reserves. Trust in the system was shaking, and it seemed America was about to go bankrupt. By the summer of 1971, the situation had become critical. European bankers openly spoke about the dollar's collapse. Panic reigned in the White House. Treasury Secretary John Connally reported to Nixon, "Mr. President, at current rates of gold outflow, our reserves will be exhausted in a year and a half. We have two choices, either bankrupt the country or change the rules of the game for the entire planet." Nixon understood any decision would be catastrophic. Continuing to exchange dollars for gold meant inevitable bankruptcy. Stopping the exchange meant breaking promises made to the entire world. But there was no choice. The American elite preferred to deceive the planet rather than admit their insolvency. August 15, 1971, Sunday, 9 p.m. Americans are watching television at home. Suddenly, the president appears on air. Nixon looks calm and confident. He speaks about protecting the American economy from international monetary speculators. He accuses other countries of unfair competition. And then he utters the phrase that turned the world economy upside down. "I have directed Secretary Conley to suspend temporarily the convertibility of the dollar into gold." The key word, temporarily. But behind the scenes, economists understood America would never return to the gold standard. This temporarily has lasted 54 years now. Nixon didn't tell the truth. He didn't admit that America simply couldn't fulfill its obligations because there was almost no gold left. Instead, he blamed the entire world for attacking the dollar. Nixon's speech shocked governments of other world countries. For them, this was real robbery. They had entrusted their savings to the U.S. under the guarantee of gold backing. And America responded, "Sorry, there will be no gold. Keep the paper bills." The president of France called Nixon's decision a monetary Pearl Harbor. The German chancellor declared that the U.S. had destroyed the foundations of international trust. The British prime minister demanded an emergency summit. Panic began on currency markets. European exchanges closed early. Nobody understood how to value assets. Now European leaders tried to create an alternative system without the dollar.
France and Germany began negotiations about a European gold bloc. But all these attempts didn't work. To everyone's surprise, it turned out that the U.S. dollar had grown too deeply into the world economy. Nobody wanted to completely abandon the dollar. And in 1974, after a series of closed negotiations, Washington and Riyadh signed a secret agreement. Saudi Arabia sells oil exclusively for dollars and reinvests the proceeds in American securities. In exchange, the U.S. guaranteed military protection of the kingdom and weapons supplies. This is how the so-called petrodollar appeared. Soon, other OPEC countries joined this agreement, which effectively established the dollar as the mandatory currency for world oil trade and created permanent and stable demand for American currency. This is how the U.S. government found a way to strengthen the dollar. Nixon put the planet before an ultimatum: either use our unbacked paper bills or trade by barter. There was no choice. After a burst of anger and bewilderment, everyone continued trading in dollars as if nothing had happened. But what changed after Nixon's speech for the masses? Formally, nothing. People still went to stores, bought products, received salaries in dollars. For ordinary people, Nixon's decision became an invisible but very tangible problem over time. Soon, inflation began. Prices for food, fuel, housing went up. Savings depreciated. Those who kept money under the mattress lost their purchasing power each year. Example: in 1970, an ounce of gold cost $35. By 1980, already more than $600. If you had stored your savings in gold, you would have increased your capital 17 times. But if you had held those same dollars, their real value would have fallen by multiples. This was slow robbery. Inflation took money away imperceptibly. For the first time in history, world money became paper bills not backed by anything material. The dollar became fiat money. It was no longer tied to any physical asset. It held only on faith that the American government wouldn't go bankrupt. But the U.S. government received incredible power. They could print dollars in any quantities and buy goods with them around the world. And other countries were forced to accept these paper bills. And ordinary people paid, and continue to pay, the price for this form of inflation. Let's look at the facts. In 1971, the average house in America cost about $24,000. Today, more than $500,000. That's a 20-fold increase. Education at a public university with room and board cost about $2,000 per year. Today, $27,000, a 13-fold increase. And family incomes? Median family income grew only 8 times. Simple arithmetic shows a dramatic deterioration in Americans' condition. A family in 1971 could buy a house for 2 to 3 years' income. Today, that same house costs 6 to 7 years' income. A new car in 1971 cost on average $3,000 to $4,000. Today, about $50,000. In other words, you now need to work twice as much to have the standard of living of your fathers or grandfathers. But there were also those for whom the collapse of the gold standard provided an opportunity for instant enrichment. The winners were those who gained access to cheap credit. Banks, funds, and corporations borrowed printed money at ridiculous interest rates and bought real physical assets with these paper bills. The financial sector inflated to monstrous proportions. In 1970, banks comprised only 4% of the U.S. economy. Today, almost a quarter. They turned into giant machines for extracting money from thin air. Derivatives, futures, complex financial instruments appeared. Bankers invented ways to turn debts into profits. This led to wealth beginning to concentrate in the hands of a narrow group of people with access to cheap printed money. Today, the top 1% of wealthiest Americans own 31% of all national wealth. The bottom 50% of the population own only 2.6% of wealth. An even more shocking fact, the 400 richest Americans have more than 150 million of the poorest U.S. citizens. The gap between rich and poor grew at unprecedented speed. In 1970, the average CEO earned 25 times more than a worker. Today, 300 times. This means a CEO earns in one day what an ordinary worker earns in an entire year. The paper money system proved extremely unstable. Without a gold anchor, economic bubbles became inevitable. Now, during crises, for example in 2008 or during the 2020 pandemic, the Federal Reserve System unhesitatingly turned on the printing press and released trillions of new dollars into circulation. This temporarily helped the economy, but accelerated inflation and drove government debt to record levels. Essentially, the country lived on credit, and future generations will have to pay for this. Developing countries fell into the dollar trap. They accumulate dollars for trade, but every American emission devalues their reserves. In effect, this way, the U.S. government continues to rob every country that stores dollars as a reserve currency. The perfect scheme for the U.S. Print paper bills, buy goods with them around the world, and let other countries pay for this with crises and inflation. But could it have been different? Some economists argue that the collapse of the gold standard was inevitable. The world economy was growing faster than gold mining, and fixed exchange rates constrained trade and development. Others argue that possibly the system needed reforms, but what Nixon did is still considered silent robbery. America could have chosen an honest path. Devalue the dollar, but preserve gold backing. Create an international currency based on a basket of commodities. Reform the system with the consent of all participants. Instead, the U.S. chose deception. They violated international treaties, deceived allies, betrayed the trust of the entire planet, and received a reward for this, a monopoly on printing world money. 53 years have passed since that August evening, and we still live with the consequences of Nixon's decision. He didn't rob a bank or steal gold from vaults. He committed a more sophisticated crime. He stole honest, real gold money from humanity. Since then, our money is not a means of preserving wealth, but an instrument of political power.